She thought no one could touch her, not even the law, until she tried to destroy a man's property and found herself facing the full weight of the justice system. Julius Merrick wasn't looking for trouble. In fact, trouble was the last thing on his mind when he pulled up to his new home in Highland Crest, a quiet, suburban neighborhood just outside Columbus, Ohio. He had spent the last 20 years entrenched in legal battles, facing down fraudsters, corrupt officials, and high-stakes criminals. Now, all he wanted was a place where he could unwind, sip his morning coffee in peace, and enjoy the silence. He had chosen Highland Crest for one reason: privacy. The property sat on a spacious corner lot, tucked behind a row of mature sycamore trees. Unlike most homes in the neighborhood, his came with a rare exemption. It wasn't under the jurisdiction of the Homeowners Association, and that was a problem for Lorraine Eckhart. The first time Julius met Lorraine, she was already watching him. He had been hauling the last of his boxes inside when he spotted her standing near the curb, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. Late 50s, thin, sharp features, the kind of woman who looked like she carried a clipboard everywhere she went, even when she didn't. "Excuse me," she called out, her tone polite but firm. "You must be the new neighbor." Julius wiped the sweat from his forehead and extended a hand. "Julius Merrick." She didn't shake it, just gave a tight smile. "Lorraine Eckhart. I run the HOA." Of course she did. "Welcome to Highland Crest," she continued. "We take pride in our community here. The HOA ensures that everything stays in order." Julius already knew where this was going. He had read the HOA's rule book before closing on the house. Restrictions on mailbox designs, an approved color palette for front doors, even a ban on certain types of holiday decorations. It didn't matter to him because none of those rules applied to his property. "I appreciate that," he said, nodding toward his house. "But I'm not actually part of the HOA." Lorraine's expression faltered for half a second before she recovered. "Oh, I know. Your property was built before the association was formed, so you're grandfathered out," she said, tilting her head. "But most homeowners still choose to join. Helps keep the neighborhood uniform. You understand?" Julius nodded but didn't answer. She cleared her throat. "Membership is just $300 a year, and it covers everything: seasonal landscaping, community events, security patrols. It's really in your best interest." Julius took a slow breath. He had no intention of paying for rules he didn't agree to, but he also wasn't in the mood for a fight on his first day. "I'll think about it," he said. Lorraine's smile didn't waver, but something in her eyes changed. "I'll send over the paperwork," she said, turning on her heel. "Welcome to the neighborhood." She walked off without another word, her heels clicking against the pavement. Julius watched her disappear down the street, and something told him that wasn't the last he'd hear from Lorraine Eckhart. He didn't realize just how right he was. Julius had barely settled in when the first letter arrived. It was neatly typed, sealed in an HOA-branded envelope, and tucked into his mailbox like an official summons. He opened it while sipping his morning coffee, already expecting a membership reminder. But instead, it was something else. A notice of violation. "Your lawn has exceeded the HOA's acceptable height limit. Please ensure it is trimmed within the next 72 hours to maintain the integrity of our community standards." There was just one problem. His grass wasn't overgrown. Julius walked outside, scanning his lawn. It was freshly cut, same as his neighbor's. Lorraine Eckhart's house sat 3 doors down, her blinds slightly parted, watching. He exhaled through his nose, petty. He tossed the letter onto the counter and went about his day. 3 days later, a second notice arrived, then a third. After the fourth, he finally decided to respond in person. Lorraine's house was exactly what he expected. Pristine hedges trimmed with surgical precision. A front door painted HOA-approved warm taupe. A flagpole that bore the Highland crest emblem instead of an American flag. She answered on the second knock. "Mr. Merrick, how can I help you?" Julius held up the latest violation notice. My lawn isn't overgrown." Lorraine didn't even glance at it. "It's a matter of interpretation." She stepped onto the porch, scanning his yard from a distance. "Some of your edges are uneven. It's a small thing, but small things add up. That's why we have rules." Julius wasn't in the mood for games. "I'm not under HOA regulations," he said, his voice steady. "I don't owe you anything. No membership fees, not compliance, not an explanation." Lorraine didn't blink. "It would be easier if you were." "For who?" She didn't answer. Instead, she clasped her hands together and let out a long sigh, as if she were the one being inconvenienced. "We all want the same thing, Mr. Merrick, a peaceful, orderly neighborhood. Surely you understand that?" Julius looked her right in the eyes. "I do, and my property isn't your business." Something flickered across her face, just for a moment, but it was enough. Then, just like before, her tight-lipped smile returned. "Of course. Have a good day." She closed the door without another word, but Julius knew it wasn't over. It was just getting started. The next few weeks were relentless. At first, it was minor inconveniences. The city received an anonymous complaint about Julius's trash bins being left out too long after collection day. Then a notice arrived about his exterior lights not matching the aesthetic of the neighborhood despite the fact that they predated the HOA. Julius ignored it all. He had bigger things to worry about. But Lorraine Eckhart wasn't done. One morning, as Julius backed out of his driveway, he spotted a tow truck idling at the curb. A contractor hired by the HOA. A man in an orange vest walked up, clipboard in hand. "Morning, sir. Just letting you know we got an order to tow your vehicle. Non-compliance with HOA regulations." Julius hit the brakes. "This woman is insane," he muttered. "I'm not in the HOA," he said, keeping his voice calm. The tow truck driver hesitated. "You're not?" He looked at the clipboard, frowned, then gave a half shrug. "Well, I was told this car is in violation." "What violation?" The driver rubbed the back of his neck. Parking in the driveway." Julius stared at him. "You realize how ridiculous that sounds, right?" The driver sighed, looking toward Lorraine's house. She was standing near her porch, pretending to trim an already perfect hedge, watching, waiting. Julius leaned in slightly. "I suggest you call whoever gave you that order before you hook up my car. I'm a federal prosecutor, and I take illegal property seizures very seriously." The driver blinked, then, without another word, climbed back into his truck and drove away. Julius didn't bother looking in Lorraine's direction. He already knew she was watching. The very next day, it escalated. Julius was in his home office, drafting a case summary when he heard a loud clank outside. Something metallic, deliberate. He stepped onto his porch and saw 2 men installing a sign at the edge of his property. "Private property, no trespassing, HOA members only." Julius rubbed his temples. "Enough." He marched over, hands on his hips. "Take it down." One of the men glanced up. "Sorry, sir. HOA directive." Julius exhaled sharply. I'm not in the HOA. That sign is illegal. The workers hesitated. One of them pulled out his phone, probably to call Lorraine. Julius didn't wait. He walked up to the signpost, gripped it firmly, and yanked it straight out of the ground. Both workers froze. You can let Lorraine know that if she wants to put up signs, even she can keep them on her own damn property, Julius said. The men exchanged nervous glances, then packed up their tools and left. Julius tossed the sign onto his porch and went back inside. That night, his doorbell rang. When he opened the door, Lorraine was standing there, arms crossed. "I have to say," she said, her voice a little too smooth, "you're making this very difficult." Julius leaned against the doorframe. "You're the one harassing me." Her lips curled into a thin smile. "No, Mr. Merrick. I'm protecting the integrity of this community." Julius let out a low chuckle. "By trying to tow my car? By putting illegal signs on my property? By sending me fake violations?" Lorraine's smile didn't falter. "You don't belong here," she said softly. Julius's expression darkened. "I own my house. That's the only requirement." Lorraine took a step forward. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." Julius didn't move. "Go home, Lorraine." For the first time, her expression cracked. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked back toward her house. Julius watched her go, his jaw tightening. This wasn't over. He had seen stubborn people before. He had spent years prosecuting cases where egos and obsessions led people to ruin. But Lorraine Eckhart, she was something else entirely. Over the next few days, her tactics became less about rules and more about punishment. A city inspector showed up at his door, citing an anonymous complaint about unpermitted renovations. Julius hadn't changed a thing in his house. The next morning, a sanitation officer knocked, responding to a report of excessive trash. His bins were empty. It was relentless. And then one night, it turned criminal. Julius had just finished a late case review when he heard it, a faint rustling outside. It wasn't the wind, it was deliberate. His instincts kicked in. Years of dealing with criminals had trained his ears for deception. He turned off his office lamp and moved toward the front window. A figure stood in his driveway. Lorraine Eckhart. Julius's stomach tensed. She wasn't holding a clipboard or one of her pointless violation letters. No, she was holding a red gas can. His pulse spiked. She moved quickly, pouring fuel along the hood of his car, then down the driver's side. Her movements were mechanical, practiced even, the kind of certainty that came from someone who thought they were untouchable. Julius didn't hesitate. He grabbed his phone and hit record. Then, just as Lorraine pulled out a lighter, he yanked the front door open. "Drop it!" Lorraine froze for a moment. The two of them just stood there. Him in the doorway, her in the driveway, lighter hovering inches above an arson charge. A flicker of something crossed her face. Panic, just for a second. Then it was gone, replaced by something worse, righteousness. She straightened, tightening her grip on the lighter. "You don't belong here," she said. Julius took a step forward, his voice low. "And you just made sure you don't either." Lorraine clicked the lighter open. A small, flickering flame appeared. Julius's stomach clenched. One flick of her wrist, and his car would be gone. Maybe more than that. Gasoline vapor was unpredictable. A spark could catch the air, crawl toward the house. But Lorraine had no idea who she was dealing with. Julius lifted his phone, screen glowing. "You're on camera every second of this." That got her attention. Lorraine's eyes darted to the screen. A muscle twitched in her jaw. For the first time, she looked unsure. Then she ran. She dropped the gas can and bolted toward her house. Julius followed, but by the time he reached the sidewalk, her front door had slammed shut. Julius exhaled, his heart pounding. He turned back toward his car, the sharp scent of gasoline filling the air. The lighter lay abandoned on the pavement, its tiny flame flickering weakly before dying out. He crouched down, snapped a few pictures, then dialed a number. It wasn't 911. He had someone better to call. Julius didn't sleep that night. He didn't need to. The pieces were already in motion. By sunrise, the neighborhood was awake, but they weren't prepared for what was coming. 2 black SUVs pulled up in front of Lorraine Eckhart's house. Federal agents. Julius stood at his window, watching as 3 men in suits stepped out, their movements precise, practiced. These weren't the kind of officers you talked your way out of. Lorraine must have seen them too, because she didn't come to the door right away. One of the agents knocked, then again harder. Julius could almost hear the conversation in his head. Lorraine standing behind the door, debating whether to open it, wondering if she could spin this into another misunderstanding. But then the agent spoke, loud enough for half the street to hear. "Mrs. Eckhart, we have a warrant. Open the door." Silence. Then the slow creak of a doorknob turning. Julius stepped outside, standing just beyond his porch. Neighbors gathered on their lawns, whispering. Some clutched their morning coffee, others held their phones, recording. Lorraine finally appeared. She still wore her usual pressed blouse and neatly tailored slacks, but her face was a different story. No smugness, no carefully controlled expressions, just fear. The lead agent held up a document. "Lorraine Eckhart, you are under arrest for attempted arson and criminal trespass. You have the right to remain silent." The rest of the words blurred. Julius didn't need to hear them. Lorraine's expression shifted fast. First shock, then anger. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice rising. "I am the head of the HOA. Do you know who I am?" The agent didn't even blink. "Ma'am, turn around." She whipped her head toward Julius. "You did this." Julius didn't move, didn't blink. Lorraine shook her head, her breath coming faster. She still didn't get it. She still thought this was a game she could win. "This is harassment," she spat. "You don't belong here, and everyone knows it." She turned toward the crowd. "You're all okay with this? With outsiders ruining our neighborhood?" Silence. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Others looked away because they knew they had watched Lorraine bully people for years, force them into ridiculous fines, turn neighbors against each other, threaten legal action over mailboxes and porch lights. She had ruled by fear, and now fear wasn't on her side anymore. One of the agents stepped forward, securing cuffs around her wrists. The click echoed through the street. Lorraine's face went white. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Julius stepped closer, his voice even. "You thought you were untouchable." He tilted his head. "Now you know better." The agent led her toward the SUV. Lorraine struggled, but it didn't matter because this time she wasn't in control. The car door shut. The neighborhood watched as the vehicle pulled away. The reign of Lorraine Eckhart was over. Julius stood in his driveway long after the SUV disappeared down the street. The weight of what had just happened settled in slowly. For weeks, Lorraine Eckhart had acted like she was untouchable. She controlled this neighborhood with an iron grip, made people bend to her rules, and believed she could bully him into submission. Now she was gone. And Highland Crest, it felt different already. By the next morning, news had spread far beyond the neighborhood. A local reporter stood on Lorraine's lawn, a camera crew behind her. "Eckhart, the longtime president of the Highland Crest Homeowners Association, was taken into custody early this morning on charges of attempted arson and criminal trespass, she announced. Residents say tensions had been rising between Eckhart and one of the newest homeowners, but few expected the situation to escalate to criminal activity. Julius sat at his kitchen table, sipping his coffee as he watched. A neighbor, Greg Thompson, appeared on the screen next, shifting uncomfortably. She always liked control, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. I think some of us knew she was a little extreme, but setting someone's car on fire, that's insane. Julius let out a slow breath. Extreme didn't even begin to cover it. But not everyone was on board with reality just yet. A second neighbor, Linda Pearson, stood outside her house, arms crossed. This whole thing is ridiculous, she huffed. Lorraine worked hard for this community. She made sure it looked nice. Now we're just letting some outsider ruin it. Julius let out a dry chuckle. There it was, even after everything. There were still people who would defend her, people who didn't care what she had done, so long as she had maintained their illusion of control. He wasn't surprised, but he also didn't care. That afternoon, a new email landed in his inbox. Subject: HOA Leadership Change. Julius opened it, skimming the first few lines. Effective immediately, Lorraine Eckhart has been removed as president of the Highland Crest HOA. An interim board will oversee association matters until a formal election can be held. He exhaled slowly. It was over. He closed his laptop and glanced out the window. The neighborhood looked normal, the same trimmed hedges, the same identical houses. But it felt different. For the first time since he moved in, he could finally breathe. No more fake violations, no more threats, no more war. 2 days later, Julius stepped outside to find a small box on his porch. No return address, no note. He crouched down, picked it up, and slowly opened the lid. Inside, neatly folded, was a Highland Crest HOA membership form. A small yellow sticky note was attached. Membership not required but welcome. Neighbor. Julius stared at it for a moment. Then slowly a grin spread across his face. He picked up the form, ripped it in half, and tossed it into the trash. Because now, Highland Crest belonged to him too. Lorraine Eckhart thought rules and intimidation made her powerful. But in the end, she learned the hard way. Control is an illusion. It doesn't matter how many fines, threats, or petty power plays you throw at people. The truth always wins. And when you cross the line, the law will always be waiting. What would you have done if you were in Julius's shoes? Ever dealt with an HOA nightmare before? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.